program are either online, in person in the late afternoon, like 4 to 7 p.m. So we've kind of designed it around working professionals. But if you're working like 8 to 6, then that may not work for you. But
well, maybe someday. I mean, right now it's crazy, but things might mellow out a little bit eventually.
okay. Well, I'll keep fighting to get the program opened. We had a meeting with the Utah State Higher Education Commission on Wednesday. And when it came turn for a CMHC to be evaluated by the commission, I introduced the program for 30 seconds, thanked them for their time and attention. They had no questions and approved it.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it was very affirming that all of the work that we've done up front, we even got an email later saying that they were very impressed with how thorough the proposal was and how well researched.
Nice.
Okay, I love you, doggos. Okay. You are a wonderful dog. And you are a wonderful dog too. And now you're getting your muddy paws all over the clothes that I won't have time to change before my date. Why do you do this to me? Oh yes, because you love me. Okay. So everybody come over and pet my dogs. They could use some attention. I love you too, Boo. You're so good girl. Ninja, you're a good boy. You're bestest boy. You're the bestest girl. Mm-hmm. Such good doggos. Okay. So these two feel like they've been out playing with their friends. Their body temperatures are up. And so why is it you like playing with your friends and then coming over and looking in my face, huh? Just you feeling friendly? Okay, now if you two will excuse me, okay? I need to teach a class now. Yes, I love you too, Boo. I love you too. From your butthole to my lips, I get it. Okay. Okay, excuse me, guys. Go ahead and get down. Get down, please. Love you. I know I'm sending you contradictory messages. Okay. So let's see. It is 11:03 and recording has started. Oh boy. Okay. So hey everybody, those are my dogs, Ninja and Boo. Ninja is an Airdoodle, which is an Airedale Terrier Poodle hybrid. And Boo, believe it or not, is a Golden Doodle. So she is darkly colored, but recessive genes are a thing. Okay, what questions do you all have about the course? Let's see, the papers are due tonight, aren't they, Kelly? The major argument papers? Okay, any last minute concerns about those guys? Oh, and I just heard their friends bark again. Okay, well, in that case, let me share what I've got. Screen one, close that. Okay, Becky, are you here?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
I can. Can you see the text on my screen?
Yep.
Excellent.
Large enough. Thank you.
Okay. So, want to tell you a story. When I was 15, one of my best friends at the time, he and his mom picked me up for a trip to the fair, and in fact, Strawberry Days, or the carnival for Strawberry Days. And driving was his mother's new boyfriend. And I got to know him. His name's Al, and he's a hell of a guy. He had recently gotten out of prison. And it seemed kind of odd for my good friend's very uptight mother to be dating a fellow who just got out of prison. And so I chit-chatted with him a little bit. Stand-up human being, enjoyed his company. And then I got home, and over the next week I was curious. And as you guys know, jail, prison records, etc., public record. In fact, there's even a website here in the state where you can look up anybody to see if they're currently in jail, what legal charges they've been convicted of, how much time they've served. Like, it's not uncommon at the clinic we'll have clients disappear, and we'll look at this particular website, and it'll tell us that they've been arrested and which jail they're in and under what charges. So back then we had to do it paper and pencil style, but it was still all public record. So I found that he had been in prison for a couple of years for sexually assaulting his children. And then I found that he had been released from prison and fully exonerated of that same crime. So about a month later, I was over at my best friend's house for a barbecue, and I sat down and asked Al what had happened. And so what he told me was corroborated by the courts, and that was Al went on a mission to New York, and while he was on his mission, he met a young lady who was actually in the hospital after a suicide attempt. And the missionaries, Al and his companion, were asked by her best friend to minister to her in the hospital, even though she wasn't LDS. And so Al felt a real magnetism from this young lady, and she felt it for him as well. I would call it sexual attraction, but Al would not feel comfortable using that language because, you know, it's taboo. And so after she got out of the hospital, he and his companion continued to teach her. She was baptized, and when he came home from his mission, they started writing letters back and forth. And 3 months after his mission, he drove all the way to New York from American Fork, Utah, picked her up, brought her back, and 3 months after that, they were sealed in the Provo Temple. The suffering of his wife did not end after they got married, and she would self-mutilate. I mean, she would cut on herself. She suffered from severe dissociative symptoms, and she attempted suicide several times. Unwisely, they thought her having a baby would cure that. And so they had one child together, and she suffered from postpartum depression and attempted suicide again from severe postpartum. And then over the years, they ended up having 5 children total. And so much of Al's life was spent trying to both work full time to provide enough money for her so she could get what she wanted and feel comforted by in terms of material goods, and try to emotionally and physically take care of her and the children, which was difficult with how much he had to work in order to provide for the wants of his wife. They lived in a very nice home in American Fork, and he was a subcontractor for plumbing. And so he ran his own crew of guys, and so he worked a lot. This is when the construction boom in the 80s started to take off. And so one day he came home from work and found that his older 2 daughters had started engaging in self-cutting. They were 10 and 12 respectively. So he didn't have time to get them into therapy because he's working, 12, 16-hour days, 7 days a week. And so talked to his wife, and she had a good friend who was a clinical social worker there in American Fork. And so he got them into therapy, or she got them into therapy. And in fact, eventually all 5 children got into therapy. Well, one day, Al decided that he couldn't keep working 16-hour days with his children psychologically decompensating. So his children started showing significant signs of depression, anxiety, self-mutilation. The older 3 children were failing school. There were issues of behavioral acting out issues amongst all of the children. And so he tried to cut his work back, which meant that he wasn't making as much money, which then really flamed up the stress of his wife even more, because he had to, in his words, put her on a budget and give her an allowance, which she took as patriarchally abusive, because he's now telling her what she can and cannot buy, etc. So this went on for a couple of years until one day he comes home to find that his wife had moved out, that she and the children had left, and he found a letter from her quite lengthy, recounting all of his sins and all of his failures as a husband. And the letter doesn't mention anything about abuse, and Al still had a copy of the letter. The next day, he comes home from work to find the sheriffs waiting for him, and he's arrested and charged with molesting all of his children. And so he goes to court, and his children were not there to present evidence against him. As you all know, in the American justice system, we have a right to face our accusers, meaning if I commit a crime against you and I go to court, I have a right to be accused by you and to see you and to hear exactly what I'm being accused of by you. The exception to that is when they're children who have been victimized. Now, there are still systems where the children will be still presented, they will still be interviewed by the lawyers on the stand, etc., and they will often be protected by other people. And so instead, it was his children's therapist. It turns out all of his children had gone to see the same therapist, and this therapist was a friend of his wife at the time. And so one after the other, he got to read stories presented by his children of the way in which he had molested them. And not only did these stories indicate that he had molested them, but he was part of a satanic cult that operated out of Mormon churches and Mormon temples, where they would take children into baptismal fonts, say in the Provo Temple, the Salt Lake Temple, what have you, and there they would ritually cut and sexually abuse the children. And so there were very lurid stories of men and women in black robes, knives, penetrative intercourse on small kids, etc. And they're horrific stories to read, and kind of scarred my 15-year-old brain. So story after story presented as evidence against him, and he kept insisting on his innocence. His lawyer kept insisting on his evidence. He even fielded, he was working 16-hour days, 7 days a week, and he was able to get testimony from his employees, from the people that he was contracting with, that he was there at work at the time when these crimes happened, but he was still convicted of molesting each one of his children in this satanic ritual sexual abuse form, and sentenced to a minimum of 50 years in prison. It was like 50 to like 300 years for these sundry crimes. And so he even tried to field evidence that none of his children showed any signs of injury. When a grown man has penetrative intercourse with a 5-year-old child, it is very physically damaging to that 5-year-old child. And so he even appealed to the court to have his children medically examined, and the prosecution objected and managed to get that overruled. So his children were never physically examined. In fact, the psychological examination of the social work, who was a good friend of his wife's, was the only evidence that the court needed. And so after spending 2 years in prison, at that point, his 17-year-old daughter kept running away from home. She was having horrible nightmares, and her horrible nightmares were not of her father molesting her in baptismal fonts full of blood, like she had said in the stand, but her nightmares were of her former therapist telling her that that's what had happened to her. Then later, after the 17-year-old runs away, her younger sister, who is 15, also starts running away. And those girls ended up being the ones to fiercely advocate for the innocence of their father. Okay? So the story that those girls started telling anybody that would listen. In fact, it was actually Al's older brother that helped the girls get in touch with lawyers, etc., to appeal to have their father released. And the girls were like, "We lied on the stand." Well, they didn't really lie. They were told by the therapist what to say. Okay, meaning they weren't intending to lie. They didn't make up the lie. They were told, here's what's happened to you by the therapist, and here's what you need to say on stand, because this is what really happened to you. So the therapist had a satanic sexual abuse cult obsession. She thought that She was a former LDS, and she thought that a former Mormon, and she thought that that's what the Mormon church was just a way to abuse children, because the therapist herself had been sexually abused by her father. And so she thought that's what Mormonism was all about, was abusing kids. And so when she would hypnotize the children, because she practiced trauma recovery therapy, meaning that all memories of abuse, if they're not conscious, they're still there, and she needed to use hypnosis to uncover them. Okay, so that's what she did. As she would hypnotize the kids, what she would tell them is, tell me of when your father sexually abused you in the church, or when using church things did your father abuse you. And so the children under hypnosis would tell these very elaborate, detailed stories. But it turned out, according to these older girls, that the therapist would tell them, would give them the prompt, would give them the, okay, so tell me more about this. And she'd be very specific. And the girls, playing along, because at the time they liked their therapist, would then tell her these very lurid stories that the therapist would then elaborate on and give back to the children to elaborate on even more. Okay. Does any of this make sense? Okay. So start the induction with, okay, now that you're induced into a hypnotic trance, tell me of how your father abused you, right? And then the stories would go back and forth in more and more and more detailed fashion. So because of the efforts of Al's older two daughters, he was fully exonerated when they were able to get a hold of the judge in the original case and the prosecutor. By the way, the prosecutor wasn't going to play ball in the original case. Prosecutor in no way wanted to look incompetent or that he had facilitated the conviction of an innocent man. But eventually, after months of effort, they got the judge to listen. Okay. So Al was released. Now, here's the tragedy. So here we are 33 years later. Okay. And I still know this man. He's still married. He's married now and has been for many years to this friend of mine's mother. His three younger children will have nothing to do with him. Okay. He's very close to his older two daughters. He's a grandfather. He gets to spend a lot of time with their kids. He's a great granddad, and a wonderful granddad. But the younger three children still believe that he, in a sexual, satanic cult fashion, sexually abused them in baptismal fonts and in the temples, and there were knives and blood and everything else, because of the stories that they told back and forth with the therapist. Okay. So he lost three of his children. They will have nothing to do with him. When he tried to contact them when they were 18, they got their mother's help to file restraining orders against him so he couldn't contact them anymore, etc. And of course, when they got divorced, she got everything when he went to prison. She got all his bank accounts, the nice house, the cars. She got everything. Okay. And interestingly enough, she got married within 3 weeks after moving out. Okay. So he has no evidence other than that to say that she probably was forming other relationships with other men, at least one, while they were still married. That marriage, the second marriage, was short-lived. The third marriage was short-lived. The fourth marriage was short-lived. And the fifth marriage was short-lived. So I was very suspicious of hypnosis, right? Because if hypnosis can be a way to help people believe false stories, then I didn't want anything to do with it. Well, I started my, later on, I was a junior in high school. So just a year later, 2 years later, shortly thereafter, I was in a health professions class with one of our favorite teachers. We called him Rock and Rod Jackman. And Jackman had a unit on hypnosis. And he actually, in class, would induce a hypnotic state in the class members. And he would do so in the entertainment way. Here's how you use things that seem like hypnosis for entertainment. And here's how you do real hypnosis. Notice how boring real hypnosis is. Okay. Notice that this is fun because it's all of us acting, right? And this is less fun because it is serious business. And so he broke down what hypnosis is and what it isn't. And then I realized that Al's children weren't actually given hypnotherapy. What they were given was a neurotic therapist who was used by the children's mother to frame their father so that she could get all of his material wealth. Okay. So implanted memories are real and they're a thing. The other thing that I learned from Mr. Jackman, Dr. Jackman, that I've learned repeatedly since, is it doesn't take hypnosis to embed a false memory. Okay? It doesn't take hypnosis to embed a false memory. This is something that my older siblings and I, for example, embedding a false memory, did to my poor little sister. My little sister to this day remembers walking in to the chicken coop that we were living in at the time and seeing me stapled to the ceiling, and how scary it was for her to see me stapled to the ceiling, where I had staples through all of my clothes. She was raised hearing the story about how I was pestering my older sisters. As you know, I have a lot of siblings. I was pestering my older sisters. They got sick of it, hogtied me, managed to lever me up on a ladder against the ceiling, and then using a staple gun, put staples through my pants and my shirt so I was hanging by staples from the ceiling. And the story went that my little sister, who was only 3 at the time, came in and saw me hanging from the ceiling and started to scream in fright and ran and got mom. None of that happened. But my little sister to this day, we've told that story over and over and over again. And from the time my sister was little, where she believes that really happened. It never did. And in fact, it's kind of eerie because one of my older sisters now talks about that experience like it actually happened. It never did. Okay. And so it was a story I started to make fun of how I was bullied by my older sisters. There are many things that happen in our lives when a story is told and retold, and it's told in vivid detail, that we can begin to believe it. In fact, one of the things that's very powerful that I found is false memory implantation. In fact, auto implantation, meaning it's something that we do to ourselves. Like working in prison and working in addictions taught me that the first person we lie to is always ourselves. Like I can be sitting down and talking to a client, and it's clear they are high AF. They are stoned out of their gourd. It's obvious to me, it's obvious to anybody else who's looking at them that they're high. We drug test them on the spot. Sure enough, their P levels of drug are off the chart, right? Their urine is just chock full of that chemical, or the metabolites for that chemical, if you want to be more exact. But they will look you right in the eye and dead set tell you they never use drugs, they don't know what you're responding to, and they're not high. And they mean it. And they genuinely believe it. The first person we lie to is ourselves, okay? And we can convince ourselves, and we're very good at convincing ourselves of some things that didn't actually happen, like me not taking drugs. So it's really fun, and in the various stuff you've read in this class, right? We learn to be very suspicious of human memory, right? 75% of men exonerated from death row by the Innocence Project were put there by eyewitnesses who vividly remember them committing the crime that physically they could not have. Okay, 75% of the men exonerated. So the same thing happens with us in our day-to-day lives. I'll look at my wife and I'll say, hey, Friday when we talked about this or this or this, she'll look at me and she said, that conversation never happened. I remember it happening vividly, but do I trust my own memory? No, I don't. So if she says it didn't happen, then I'll say, oh, well then last Friday when we didn't speak about this and this, let me tell you about it now so we can have that conversation, right? Rather than say, yes, I did. And we talked about this and you were wearing that hoodie and you have that pair of shoes and you looked at me like I was crazy. Nope, I don't trust my own memory anymore. I don't trust hers either. So therefore, we have a lot of back and forth. Okay, so as we talked about last time, hypnosis doesn't actually increase accuracy of memory. It increases confidence of memory, it increases detail, but it doesn't increase accuracy. So therefore, like Al's 3 younger children, they have these very vivid recollections of things that never happened, that they're extremely confident in. And so it does not foster actual reliving of traumatic childhood events. That's one of the things that people get worried about when they start learning hypnotherapy or hypnoinvestigation, is it does not do that. In fact, one of the things that we find is there are levels and types of forgetting. Okay, so to be a little perhaps overly simple, let's say something bad happens to me. Again, I've lived a pretty rough life. So let's say something bad happens to me again. There are various ways I can respond to that in terms of memory. One of the ways I can respond to that is by saying, okay, I'm going to endeavor not to remember this. This is what is called motivated forgetting. So sometimes we're motivated to forget something, but we can't. It's like a popcorn kernel stuck, or a popcorn husk stuck between our teeth, right? It's just there. It keeps bugging us and bugging us and bugging us. And we try not to go there, but our mind keeps going there. Okay. So we can't really forget it. Another is where we can. When it comes to mind, in our mind, we look the other way. We're like, no, I'm not going to go there. I can't remember that right now. Okay. But there's another where we get so good at it, we just go, no, I'm never thinking about this again. And we don't. Okay. So for those of you that took my abnormal psychology class, if you remember, we have a unit on this, on dissociation and memory, where in working with certain clients, there are events that the clients can't remember, and to go there would require us to construct a memory that they don't have in order to fill in the gaps, okay? Meaning that they've gotten so good at not thinking of that particular event that it doesn't exist for them anymore. And then for us to create it would be extremely traumatic for them. Okay, so that's motivated forgetting. There is also unmotivated forgetting, meaning that the trauma of the event does not make sense to the person that the trauma happens to, so they have no way of making sense enough of it to remember it. Okay, and that's what's called unmotivated forgetting, or trauma memory, where I can't make sense of it. Now, one of the things that makes trauma memories very challenging, but importantly challenging to work with in hypnotherapy and hypnoinvestigations, is that when a story is incomplete, when there are gaps in the story of our memory, it's actually the gaps that cause a lot of the distress, interestingly enough, because we tend to fill in the gaps with the worst possible things, or assumption of the worst possible things. So under hypnosis, what you can do is you can actually help people fill in the gaps, not necessarily with what really empirically, historically happened, but with things that make sense that are not as traumatic as what they fear. Okay. Now, you as the therapist, or you as the investigator, need to embrace that what you're doing is you're taking a memory that's this big and this traumatic with gaps in it, and helping lower the overall intensity by filling in the gaps with things that realistically fit in that context, that makes sense, but are not what the client fears. And so this takes a lot of investigation on your part to kind of suss out with the client what they're afraid happened during their gaps. Okay. And then as you are retelling the story with them under hypnosis, to help them fill in the gaps in a way that is less traumatic than what they fear. It's deliberate. There's questions on about the ethics, because some people believe in capital T empirical truth is the only moral good. Other people argue that truth is actually as constructed as it is empirical, and therefore the truth that we can negotiate that is less traumatic is a better truth than whatever unmemorable, unrecallable truth that may be empirically true. Okay, so suggestion-prone clients are at risk of implanted memories when working with an incompetent or untrained clinical hypnotist. Okay. One of the things you get really, really good at, and it's very important to practice for those of you who are interested in doing hypnotherapies, is increasing your competence, knowing what hypnosis is good for, what it isn't, and limiting and narrowing your practice to just those things that hypnosis can actually do, which is surprisingly little. If you remember up here, basically what it does is improves focus and relaxation, and that's it. When we're relaxed, it's easier for us to deal with hard things than when we're stressed out. Like, do I have it on? I do. So my buddy Kira just sent me a tweet, forwarded me a tweet from somebody else, where she's like, let me see if I can find it real quick. Excellent, I found it. Thank you, guys. So what this tweet says is, when somebody blows up at you, like cuts you off in traffic or is bitchy at you in the line at the grocery store, at Starbucks or whatever, people usually and most often don't go 0 to 60 that fast, 0 being calm and 60 being upset. What happens is that many people are running at 59 miles an hour. Okay. So therefore, that one little inconvenience at the grocery store was that extra thing that pushed them over the top. It's like one of the paradoxes of doing trauma work and doing work around panic disorder is not addressing necessarily the trauma directly at first or addressing the panic. It's looking at their overall life. So let's say you know somebody who has a trauma history and they're working full-time, going to school full-time, raising a disabled child, all of these other things going on where they're already stretched to the limit. What that does is that lessens their ability to deal with their trauma. So therefore things are traumatizing because they're already maxed out. Anything, another straw landing on their back could break them for the day, right? And so by engaging in their life and helping them limit the number of straws that are on their back, you actually make their trauma less traumatic. No, you could increase their capacity, to deal with the traumas that they have, because their overall weight is lower. Like by helping people say no, simplify their lives, etc., you can decrease the rate of panic attacks and panic disorder. And it's often frustrating for clients because they're like, why aren't you treating my panic attacks? And my answer is, because I'm not there when you panic. You come into my office, you're finally relaxed because you're sitting with me and there's a nurturing, warm space. You're in a comfortable lazy boy in a blankie, and you've got that big bowl of fancy chocolate next to you that I encourage you to partake of. You're here, you're loved and you're cared for, and you're very relaxed when you're in my office. It's out there that you stress out and freak out. I'm not there with you. So therefore, I'm going to help you lower all of your stress out there. And let's see what that does to your panic. And oh my gosh, the panic rates go way down, right? So hypnosis is a way to get people very relaxed in the session. And that relaxation then lowers the stress burden that they're always carrying, which means that then they can handle the stress of the trauma memories or the trauma events. Okay. By going over and over a traumatic event in their life under induction starts to change the meaning of the trauma from something they cannot deal with because they haven't been able to something they can deal with because they get practice dealing it with you over and over again. Okay. And it's interesting how that switch in meaning from something I can't handle to something I can helps the mindset shift from victim to survivor. And as a therapist, I rarely have to use that language. All I'm doing is helping them retell their story with somebody who is warm, fuzzy, and who cares about them. And therefore, they experience their own capacity to deal with the trauma. Okay. It takes a while. Like EMDR is like kicking down the door and doing the same thing very abruptly and very aggressively. What I do takes a lot longer, but it is much more palatable to the client. Not to say that EMDR doesn't help. There's a reason why so many practice it. It's that it's more of a heavy-handed approach to the same thing. So if a hypnotist is called for, notice the hypnotist should not be affiliated with the investigative body. Okay, this is, although it is our unit of police psychology, human beings are incredibly sensitive to subtlety, interpersonal subtlety. So if you're coming in with the agenda of working for the police on a case, that will affect how you relate to the client, okay? And often in 1,001 subtle ways. So the hypnotist should not be informed about the case. Like if I'm going, and I've never done this, but I've worked with people who have, if I am asked to do an investigative hypnosis, it's really flying blind. You have no idea what you're even asking for, because if you ask for it, you're risking creating the memory of it. Okay. So if you are the clinical hypnotist, get informed consent. Okay. Meaning sit down with the client, and this is before your biopsychosocial, before everything, before they even agree to be your client, and say, here's what I'm going to do to you. It's called hypnosis, and here's all it really does. All it does is help increase relaxation and increase focus, and that's it, right? And then while you're in this more relaxed state, I'm going to ask you some very open-ended questions, okay? So one of the things you do is you ask the client to free associate. What that means is you will say a word, and they are instructed under hypnosis to say the first word back that comes to mind. Okay. Like some of you have taken my counseling and psychotherapy class. We talk about free association, but I gave up years ago of trying to do it in class after years of failing to do it, because people are very self-conscious when they're in front of a classroom. So therefore they would tend not to actually free associate. You can tell when somebody's not free associating. So free association is if I say, okay, Kelly, say the first thing that comes to mind when I say the word Chevy, right? And then if she pauses, then I know that she's not free associating. Free association is extremely quick when somebody's actually doing it. The first thing that pops to mind, a word, a feeling, a phrase, an object, whatever the first thing that pops to mind is, then you know they're free associating. Even if it's what? Like they may not know what a Chevy is, right? So that's still an example that yes, they're free associating when their response is immediate. If there's a pause, that means they're editing. That means they're searching for an acceptable answer, either a morally acceptable answer because they're highly perfectionistic, or an answer that will please me. And so they're searching through their memory for, okay, will Draper actually like this answer? That's not free association. So you need to redirect. The nice thing is when a client is under induction, their likelihood to freely associate goes up because they're relaxed, okay? So when you get interesting responses, you use open, non-directive probes. So if I say Chevy, and let's say Kelly says grandpa, now it may be that her grandpa owned a Chevrolet vehicle, and maybe that's it. So I would say, okay, grandpa, and then she would add more words. Sweater, right? Maybe grandpa had a sweater. So sweater, warmth, comfort, right? Okay, so now we've got a chain of meaning. Grandpa had a Chevy, grandpa liked to wear sweaters, and grandpa was warm and comfortable, right? But if other words come up, Chevy, and the first word that comes to mind for her is fear, then you would ask questions about, tell me more about fear, okay? Tell me more about what you're afraid of. Things like that. Well, it could have been that the story may come out that Kelly was once locked in a trunk of a large Chevy by her cousins, right? And that might be traumatic. And so again, it would be frustrating, I can imagine, to be an investigative hypnotist because you don't even know what you're looking for. You're literally flying blind. So when you come across something traumatic, and by the way, this is something that you can do on the therapy side as well, is you can do what's called slow motion and stop action techniques, which are very helpful in filling in some details, okay? Slow motion means you can actually tell and work with the client, let's slow it down, okay? Let's slow it down. What did this feel like? What did you feel with your hands? What did you smell? What did you hear, right? The more sensory it is based, the more vivid memory you can construct, Okay, the more vivid the recall. Again, that's risky because, as you know, hypnosis increases our confidence in memory, but does nothing about actual accuracy. What you're after, though, on the therapy side is that confidence, because when people can get clear about what happened to them, then they have a better capacity to deal than a memory that's traumatic and vague and uncertain. Okay, by increasing certainty, as painful as that certainty may be, now they can move ahead because now they believe they know what happened, and for all you know, they're right. So stop action techniques is stop right there. Okay, so just stop right there. And so slow motion, let's slow it down, stop action. What do you see? What do you smell? What do you hear? What were you thinking or feeling at the time, if anything? Those techniques can be very helpful for completing the narrative and adding detail. Now, if you're engaging in investigative hypnosis, it is highly controversial, and there are some states that don't even allow it. They just don't. Utah does allow it. And in fact, what's frustrating, if you remember that earlier in this unit when I mentioned that Utah doesn't even have very clear criteria of what it takes to be a forensic evaluator for the courts. In fact, Utah last year published a new set of guidelines that were far more rigorous than the previous sets of guidelines. Okay, it was fascinating to me that for 50 years, 60 years, 70, as long as there have been psychological evaluators, you could have a high school diploma and hire yourself out to the courts to be a psychological investigator. So now the criteria are going up, but they're even far less than I would prefer as a mental health practitioner. I think that you need to be very familiar with not only the techniques of investigation, but also the research around it. Okay, so in Utah, what you uncover as a hypno investigator or as a hypnotherapist is admissible in court in the state of Utah. And I'm a little nervous about that because of the issues of hypnosis increasing memory while doing nothing for accuracy. It still worries me. I think that personally, this is according to Draper 2020, is that maybe evidence uncovered under hypnosis shouldn't be admitted in court, and that we should use hypnosis for therapy, not for convicting somebody of a crime. Okay? Personal opinion, controversial though it is. Okay, so what questions do you all have about hypnosis, hypno-investigation, hypnotherapy, etc.?
Matt, I've got 2 questions for you.
Please. Becky.
Number one, are you an American Fork Caveman alumni?
I am not. I'm one of the evil Vikings. So Pleasant Grove.
Because Rod Jackman taught at American Fork High School for a minute.
Actually, he A days he was at AF, and B days he was at Pleasant Grove.
Ah.
So he bounced back and forth.
I had one of his elective classes. He was rockin' Rod.
Yep, I miss that guy. He set me straight on a bunch of things. Because as you know, I am a man of loud opinions, and as a teenager, even more so.
He actually taught at
very
Mountain View.
popular.
What, you know Rod as well, Kelly?
Yeah, I took a class from him as well in high school at Mountain View.
Oh my God.
Wow.
You know, it's one of those where being a young narcissistic jerk, he was coming in and, he's got all this medical background and training. I'm like, Rod, why are you here? You could be making so much more money. And he actually got real with me. And he said he was in the surgery theater. And the first time he had to use a scalpel to cut somebody open, he did it. They completed the surgery, but it took every ounce of will for him to do that. And he swore never again. He aborted his medical training right then and became a high school teacher. And to our benefit, right? He was an amazing teacher.
He was a blast.
In fact, his medical terminology class, I still remember, even all these years later. So what was your other question, Becky?
So my second question was, within like the realm of Utah, have they ever proven that the satanic ritual abuse actually happened? I have a close family member that's 40 years old now, and she swears that something happened to her. So I just am wondering, like, have they ever been able to prove any of those allegations?
Oh boy, how do I respond to this? Yes and no. Okay. On the yes side, that there are individuals who have individually abused children, and they have done so with the trappings of very dark things. Okay. And those cases have been more or less proven. What has not been proven is that President Thomas S. Monson led a cult with tubs full of blood and babies were sacrificed while little children were all that. In fact, they've been actively and proactively disproven. Like, it's one of those where if I were the devil, and you'd be shocked to learn that I'm not, I would set it up the way it's been set up, where the witnesses to these crimes are not credible, and the people accused of the crime have multiple aliases to prove they were elsewhere, right? Including videotape to show they were elsewhere. Like, I can remember one of my former clients was very specific about the day and time she was ritually sexually abused by a regional authority. And when I checked on it, that regional authority was on camera in another part of the state doing a regional conference. You know what I mean? And so things like that keep happening where they're clearly traumatized, but in the memory that they've constructed is very vivid and real, but there's so much contradictory evidence. So I too know people, I've had a lot of clients who have insisted that it was ritual satanic abuse. What matters to me is that they were abused, and I'm not going to get in the weeds about whether or not it was ritualistic and to prove them wrong. If they're in my office, then what we're going to deal with is the experience. Oftentimes, through these trauma therapies, they switch from victim mode to survivor mode, and sometimes, often, the details of the abuse changes. Not commonly, but a pattern is very interesting that for some of my clients, especially around the more ritual abuse accusations, when they began to, in a safe space with me, revisit those memories, it was easier for them, it turned out, to talk about it as a cult or an organization than to really get clear that the stepfather who loved them so much and took care of them would come into their rooms at night and molest them, right? That the cult thing is more fantastic, it's less personal than the harsh and heartbreaking reality that somebody that they loved was the one who was perpetuating the crime and victimizing them. So I don't know what's true for your relative, but I do know that, again, that if I were the devil, I'd lay it out just the way it happened, because it's very, very difficult to prove. And yeah, in fact, ironically enough, for those of you that are actually familiar with the Church of Satan, child molestation is aberrant in the Church of Satan, right? And so when they say satanic sexual abuse and it's, the satanic thing, it always makes me wonder, well, which Satanism? Because there's as many Satanisms as there are Christianities. And the largest satanic organization, they're intolerant of abusing children. And so, yeah, but don't know. Does that help at all, kind of help add more confusion to the confusion?
Yeah. I mean, we acknowledge that something did happen. We're just trying to help this relative move forward in the best way, and they're having a hard time. So
yeah, and it's hard when you know something that happened and you have memory, then something did. What we get to wonder, knowing how fallible memory is but we don't necessarily know what, right? Okay, well, guys, it looks like we're out of time for today, so we will revisit this a week from Monday, because I think you guys have next week off, don't you? Okay, so my advice is eat your elephants a bite at a time. And so eat a extra bites between now and Monday if you're able. So maybe you can take a day off on Thursday and Friday. Okay. So I know for some of you with many obligations, that's not necessarily possible, but if it is, front load your work and take some time off. Okay. So we will see you all a week from Monday. Bye-bye, everybody.